food. I study soil science, I research African food systems, how they respond to climate change. They're being decimated right now. 2022, East Africa had a drought. 100,000 people died. 100,000 people died. A whole host of reasons, right? Mainly famine. From Somalia, Kenya. They're subject to a food system which is not responsive to climate impacts. Let's just situate ourselves in where we are right now, right? We're sitting in the middle of Rosebank in Johannesburg, and it's about 33 degrees outside in March.
Record-breaking is my understanding as well.
Record-breaking after a record-breaking February, and it's not stopping. The point here is that the climate crisis is really bad right now, and it gets exponentially worse. So it's not this gradual thing that gets worse and worse. You shoot, right, to devastating temperatures. We listened to the story from this guy in Mpumalanga. His mother died.
Hi everyone, welcome to the first ever Climate Comms podcast. My name is David Lytle from Mobilize. Today we're going to discuss the Integrated Resource Plan, also known as the IRP. To do that, we're joined by two awesome guests. And with that said, I'll let them introduce themselves.
Hi, I'm Rosalind Dos Santos. I studied at WITS, chemical engineering, master's in metallurgy, also finished an MBA. In my day job, I'm the Group Energy Manager for Impact. We're the largest recycler in South Africa and do paper and plastic packaging. I also run the youth group for SANIA, which is the South African National Energy Association, and have been doing this for a number of years now. The views I'll be talking through on the IRP are my own, informed by 15, 16 years of working experience.
Very cool.
Cool, and I'm Malik Dasoo. Great to be here. Thank you for having me. I am a soil scientist by training. That's what I did my master's in University of Wageningen in the Netherlands. I came
Say that
back.
again?
Wageningen University and Research.
That is impressive.
In the Netherlands. It took me a while to get the pronunciation right of that. I came back terrified by the prospects of what climate breakdown will do to this country, and realized that working my 9-to-5 job, which I'm still in, may not make the difference, and I need to do more as an individual to do that. And that's why I volunteer for an outfit called Extinction Rebellion Gauteng, which does direct action to get government and corporates to take much more urgent action on the climate and ecological emergency. I'll also be speaking on my personal views, not representing any organization's views.
Awesome. So that means we can get some more spicy takes if we're talking personally and not on behalf of organizations. So that's very cool. All right. But thank you both for joining us today. And we're really, really excited to go into this topic, particularly as IRP, the Integrated Resource Plan, which we're talking about, its public comment period is actually closing in this coming week on the 22nd. So now's really a good time for people to have a good idea of it. So as this goes to NEDLAC, which we'll talk more about, people can understand what this plan is and the role it plays. With that said, I think let's jump straight into the questions, guys, and what we're going to talk about today. So I want to start with just actually explaining what the IRP is for our listeners. Roz, do you want to just talk us through the basics of what it is, what it's for, et cetera, et cetera?
Sure. So the IRP is a blueprint for the new energy capacity that's coming on the South African grid. And it talks about different energy that's going to be added from multiple sources, some of them renewable, some of them more traditional thermal fossil fuels. This IRP in particular is divided into two periods, so it goes up to 2030, and then it's got a 2031 to 2050 period as well. So obviously a little bit more detail in the earlier phase, because it's a lot easier to forecast, it's a lot closer, we've got a lot more information on where we are now, and then it's a little bit more vague in the later phase with multiple scenarios being run.
Do you want to talk quickly or expand upon for me what it's supposed to do? Cool, so it's explaining that energy, the energy that we're going to need to power the nation and where we get it from, but what is the purpose of the plan as part of that overall?
Sure. Maybe the best way to talk about it is to talk about the first IRP. And the first IRP that out in South Africa was really quite transformative. It was what led to the Renewable Energy Independent Power Procurement Program, which at its time was one of the leading renewable energy programs globally. It started the renewables energy, it started all of the bid rounds. So it was really the start of shifting to more renewable energy on the grid. There's obviously been a few versions since then. And in my opinion, they've gotten more vague as the years have gone on and less clear, less driven towards sort of renewable energy addition, less driven, in my opinion, towards climate action and reducing emissions. One of the good things about the last IRP before the 2023 version is through public consultation, we selected the least cost IRP. And because of the way that the technologies have really developed, least cost actually now talks about solar and talks about wind, because these are the cheapest kilowatt hours that you're actually going to get. So hopefully with sort of the pressure of economics and economic incentives, we will drive towards more of a renewable and transformed electricity grid. But at the moment, this RFP just sort of puts out a lot of options and it doesn't really indicate very clearly where we're going to be going. There's some things that are quite clear. For example, pushing up the EAF on the coal fleet, its energy availability factor, and it just talks about when the plants are actually able to deliver energy into the grid. But in terms of exactly which generation sources is going to come on when, I think there could be a lot more clarity, which hopefully we'll get from consultation.
No, that makes a lot of sense. I think for listeners as well who haven't maybe heard of the EAF, the energy availability factor, it's basically the percentage at which power plants are online. So if we say there's an energy availability factor of 50% in the coal fleet, which are the coal power plants, that means they're online for about half the time, which is not good. But we're not necessarily going to go into that now. There was a lot of interesting things I think you talked about there, Roz, that I'd love to explore further. But before we do that, I really want to go to you, Malik. Specifically from the perspective of the climate crisis and consultation and public processes. We understand there's a difference between this IRP and the way the 2019 one was constructed and deliberated on. I know Roz touched on it there with the public consultation, but do you want to maybe explore that a little bit further for me now? And yeah.
Sure. So firstly, I should mention that I'm not an energy expert, but the IRP, as I understand it, basically is supposed to tell us about the guarantee in supply of energy affordability, and speak to our carbon emission reduction standards. As Roz mentioned, 2019's IRP was more ambitious, a little bit clearer. This one goes backwards, in our opinion. And there's significant problems with that, right? One is that in terms of energy availability, it's not clear that this IRP is going to give us a more certain energy future than the 2019 IRP did. In terms of affordability, some models suggest these model is more expensive than could have been. And in terms of climate commitments, it goes nowhere near what the country needs to be doing to meet its own self-imposed nationally determined contributions to emissions reductions. So it falls short on all three fronts, which is devastating news, right? You need an energy ministry that's alive to all three, because people are suffering from energy poverty right now. We are in a load shedding crisis. People can't afford electricity when they don't even get it when they can afford it. And we are not doing nearly enough to curb our emissions. And our consultation procedure was supposed to hear these concerns properly, and instead they totally missed the boat. Would you like me to talk about why they did that?
Oh, definitely.
So first, I should say again, I'm not an energy expert, right? When they put out the invitation for consultations early Jan, I went in there not as an energy expert. It was a 2.5 hour long meeting with some technocrat from government speaking language I just couldn't understand, right? His presentation itself was like an hour and a half. Then he asks you, what do you think? Right? That's not consultation. That's not due procedure.
Acceptable, yeah.
You can't engage with that. It's modeling, it's graphs, it's complex. You can't engage with it. And so you're just left dumbfounded. And it's a deliberate strategy, right? So they do two things, right? One is they make the proposed plan unambitious, right? So they give you nothing, right? And so when you go into your consultation, you ask for things, they make compromises. And when you win those compromises, it makes you feel like you participated. But actually, they were willing to compromise on those from the start, right? So it's there to placate the public. The second thing is that they deliberately make it confusing, right? So that you get less participation from the public, right? You can't raise affordability issues because you don't know how they did their affordability modeling. The energy security supply is totally misguided. They talk about renewables in a very weird way, concentrated solar. It's CSP, I think they refer to, which is not actually what the public had been asking for, at least not from civil society. So they do all these things to just misdirect the public in terms of due procedure, which is unethical.
So I think something that came through from both your inputs was that this is a less ambitious IRP. And this is something lots of experts and activists and anyone who's really interested in the IRP, which probably should be everyone, considering it's what would solve load shedding, it's what deals with the climate crisis, well, part of what does. But Ros, could you explain specifically what makes this IRP less ambitious, both from solving our energy crisis, or if it is less ambitious in terms of solving the energy crisis, and more specifically, why this is less ambitious in terms of solving the climate crisis?
Sure, yeah, happily. Before I start, can I just pick up on Malik's point about where the data comes from? So one of the things that's been happening, and one of the concerns that's been spoken about quite a bit in sort of many sort of fora, the data that they've pulled in comes from Lazard. Lazard's a big international database, and it's got some decent sort of across the board modeling forecast of generation. But one of the biggest critiques that I'm hearing, and I'm hearing it quite often, is why are we not taking the data from our own IRP program? Yes, there were definite issues with one of the last REAP rounds when we had bids going in and then massive swings in both sort of cost of steel, cost of aluminium, making it impossible for a lot of the projects to close. So maybe that's not the best round to look at where record low prices were achieved in the bidding, but maybe the previous round where we could actually use local data, because we have run a few rounds of procurement and there have been some very successful projects. So hopefully during consultation, maybe some of this actual on the ground tested data from South Africa goes in, and then it gives a better like true cost of generation, which would probably lead to renewables sort of shining through as lowest cost and one of the best options. But yeah, you're right. It's a little bit difficult to get the data. The data is available on the DOE website. They've got the spreadsheets up there, but even if you open them and look through them, it's not that everybody's going to be like conversant and is going to be able to go through it in detail and understand what's happening. So I think it's fair, and the comments can come through about like where is this information coming from.
I think that's a really interesting point, is that there's accessibility and there's accessibility. So something can potentially be accessible to independent experts, but the public consultation is not only supposed to be for independent experts, it's supposed to be for society as a whole because it affects all our futures. So going back to what we were talking about before, and specifically that 2019, the previous iteration of the IRP, was a lot more ambitious, particularly from a climate crisis point of view, but also potentially from the energy crisis, the short-term load shedding crisis we have. Ros, would you mind kind of unpacking that a little bit for us? And specifically, in what ways is this version of the IRP less ambitious?
Well, I think it's quite interesting, but maybe also factual, that the IRP assumes that load shedding is going to continue up to the 2030 horizon. We'd have to have a lot of generation coming online to stop it. We'd also have to have very good performance in the coal fleet. And EAF's a combination. It's basically sort of the total availability minus planned maintenance and minus unplanned maintenance. And the unplanned maintenance or breakdowns, they call the UCLF, unplanned capacity load factor. And that's what's skyrocketing up and causing a lot of the problems that we're having with load shedding. When your unplanned maintenance is double what you're doing in planned maintenance, it's very, very hard to run an electricity system. And you would think that there would maybe be more of a focus in closing the gap between supply and demand more urgently, or perhaps at least closing it at all times when there wasn't peak demand on the grid. Because obviously the demand on the grid isn't constant, and you see it also in the way that electricity is priced. There's a peak in the morning when we all get up and switch on our kettles and have a shower, and then our geysers go on and pool pumps go on, and then there's the same in the evening when we get home from work. And the system operator has to balance supply and demand in real time all the time. And that's why often you have these issues. And previously, our open cycle gas turbines that run on diesel at the coast, they were being used for this peaking as well as our pumped storage. But now there's more and more utilization of this sort of more flexible plant that's not allowing us to really have enough reserves for when we need to meet the peak. And then we're taking load shedding to fill up the dams. Other things that are surprising about this IRP, for me, it was surprising that energy efficiency wasn't mentioned. I know that we've done a lot in the past with demand side management and energy efficiency. Perhaps we've already taken a lot of that low-hanging fruit, but that's some of the quickest opportunity that you can have. Another thing that I found strange is we're looking to move towards a liberalized market. We've also got the ERA bill coming through, talking about how we're separating generation, transmission, and distribution, and eventually getting us to sort of like a spot market or a day-ahead market for electricity. And there's obviously massive economic.
Can you clarify what a spot market or day-ahead market is?
Sure. So eventually we would be able to choose to buy power either in long-term contracts or in shorter-term contracts, or even by like going on to a market or an exchange of the day.
Okay, so price changes based on
supply, demand, and
supply and
availability,
demand. Okay.
which is a powerful economic incentive for getting people to shift their consumption when you actually need it on the grid. Other countries have actually started offering sort of free power at certain times of the day to ensure that that's when people are actually like ramping up demand, because they know that there's excess supply. For example, with solar energy, it's renewable, and it can change based on weather and cloud cover. But over a large period of time, you pretty much know that between 9 and 4, you're going to have a big spike in the day. So a lot of countries are actually starting to give like free power middle of the day to certain segments of society. And this could potentially actually be a great thing for South Africa if it's something that we could unlock. Obviously, we're very far away from it with the big difference in demand and supply at the moment.
But before we go back to and touching on the solar for a second, I think there's also an interesting point there about we also have, one of the advantages we have as a country is we're a big country. So if it's cloudy in Joburg, it's not necessarily cloudy in Cape Town. So also solar kind of can measure out in that way. But something I want to ask specifically about solar. So my understanding is with this IRP, there's a reduction in the amount of solar and there's a reduction in the amount of wind expected to be connected to the grid. Do you know what that's about and why there's that reduction in there?
I didn't read it as much of a reduction, more that a lot of the solar and renewable energy was being pushed into the hands of the private sector. When you look at how much sort of private energy they're looking to procure per year, and then they've estimated it being about like 900 megawatts coming in. So
is that the distributed
energy? So I read it as there's going to be less centrally procured through like programs like REAP. And there's going to be more that's going to be built either by individuals and their homes, maybe communities, because one thing about solar and renewable energy is it's great for like distributed generation. It's also great for like areas that the grid hasn't reached yet. Although overall we do have fairly good electrification rates in South Africa. It was a big drive. I think we're sitting in the high 90s. But
and to clarify for listeners, that's the amount of people that have access to electricity.
Yes.
when it's on.
Yes.
Unfortunately, load shedding undermines that a little bit.
Yeah, absolutely. And it's also a little bit more complex than that. I mean, like the social side of things is not my forte. Like I'm more energy, but a lot of people have access to electricity but won't actually use it because sort of on a rand per gigajoule basis, it is one of the more expensive sources of energy. So maybe even people that have electricity will only perhaps be using it for lighting and won't be like reaping the benefit of like better emission reductions and better indoor air quality when you cook on electricity versus cooking on, say, like kerosene or paraffin. So yeah, I'm going to leave it to the experts to talk about it. But just from an energy point of view, even if you have access, it doesn't mean like you're using energy the same way that a consumer anywhere else in the world would be using it.
That's a really interesting point as well. And our sister campaign, Energy Comms, has talked a lot about that, is that energy is not just electricity. Energy is all the things we use, whether it's burning wood in a stove to cook or heat your house. In fact, I'd really recommend listeners, we're about to publish our next research report on working communities and impoverished communities, talking about how some of them are having to burn plastic to heat their homes, which is really, really toxic. But I think this is a good segue to go back to you, Malik, to really talk about the importance of the IRP, I think, in two senses here. One is the climate crisis and the urgency of the climate crisis. I know you've spoken a lot online, particularly about how sometimes when we get stuck in dealing with the urgency of things like load shedding or some of our other crises we don't think about the potential famines that can come from climate change, the specific crises and those sort of things. Would you be able to speak for a second about that? I think, so talking one to the specifics of how people are affected by the climate crisis, but also then more broadly, how if we don't have an ambitious IRP, what this means in terms of the climate crisis.
Yeah, well, let's just situate ourselves in where we are right now, right? We're sitting in the middle of Rosebank in Johannesburg, and it's about 33 degrees outside in March, right?
Record-breaking is my understanding as well.
Record-breaking after a record-breaking February, and it's not stopping. The point here is that the climate crisis is really bad right now, and it gets exponentially worse. And what exponentially worse means is it gets really bad really quickly. So it's not this gradual thing that gets worse and worse. You shoot, right, to devastating temperatures. And then to talk about what it means for people, right? So, for example, we were in Energy Indaba last weekend, talking to communities in preparation for an action coming up this week, which I'll mention in a moment. But we listened to the story from this guy in Mpumalanga. His mother died the past 2 weeks because he couldn't keep his fridge on with electricity to refrigerate the insulin. So she died, right? Because it's too hot. You can't keep it cool enough. People die, right? Same time, we're in a water crisis. Pumps aren't able to get water to people, to where people need it, because there's not enough electricity to keep the pumps going. They fall apart. So it's, the climate crisis is everything. It's every sector of society. And we're not doing anything to mitigate it, right? This updated IRP, it talks about the delay in decommissioning coal plants. That's a death sentence for people, right? A direct death sentence, because we have about 20,000 people who die every year in this country, which is a conservative estimate, as a result of direct exposure to air pollution, right? That doesn't even mention how many people die of heat stress, or like that guy whose mother died in Mpumalanga because she couldn't access her insulin, right? These are climate factors. That's what this IRP doesn't talk about. It doesn't talk about externalities. It doesn't get anywhere close to meeting our climate ambitions. I just want to touch on gas for a second, right? Mm-hmm. There's a big reliance on gas for peaking, right? Basically, as Rod mentioned, when demand goes super high, if our current sources aren't able to meet it, can use gas to meet that supply. But, gas is 83 times more potent as a greenhouse gas than CO2 because of methane emissions, right? Methane is 83 times higher, sorry. Methane, goes into the atmosphere when gas systems leak, right? If you look at our government, do we trust them to provide the infrastructure to make sure that gas leaks don't happen? No, right? And so these things compound on each other and get progressively worse. So it doesn't meet anything near what we need to do to meet the climate crisis.
So you were talking for a second about how methane is 83 times higher, but a lot of the arguments behind switching to gas for our peaker plants, which are the ones that fill in the gaps in our electricity requirements, are that it does produce less carbon emissions. But you're talking about leaks and what that means. Do you want to explore that a little bit further for me?
Yeah. Well, greenhouse gases aren't just carbon dioxide. Methane is a greenhouse gas. Methane is a lot more potent, especially in the near term, right, which is about 20 years. In 30 years, it gets even more potent, but it has a shorter life cycle than CO2. But the point is, in terms of immediate heat impacts on the planet, methane is a death sentence, right? And so, methane gets leaked when, exactly as you say, gas doesn't get to where it needs to go because of faulty infrastructure, because of whatever reason, and that gets into our atmosphere. Now, the IRP conveniently ignores this, right? Because gas is touted as this clean fuel, right? I mean, they also talk about clean coal, right? They talk about all of these things, which are basically there to maintain our dependence on big energy producers. They don't want to talk about distributed systems, right? And we can talk about the benefits of distributed renewable sources of electricity, especially for poorer areas. But they don't want to talk about that because that breaks the status quo, right? And that's what scares them. So they won't talk about the potency of methane. They won't talk about the fallacy of clean coal. And that's another major, horrible emission from this IRP.
I think that's really fascinating, particularly about the clean coal, and I'd want to explore that a bit more. We've heard it definitely in international contexts, but not really talked about in South Africa very much. Before I come to that, though, you referenced a statistic about people dying from pollution. I think what's fascinating is, I know statistics we've looked at and we're covering in some of our content, is that Eskom, I think, says about 200 people a year die from emission from their power plants. Whereas I think other assessments say it's up to 10,000. And then I imagine what you're referring to is including beyond just the power plants. Something you described as well was, as things get hotter, we actually need to use more electricity to get by. So it's almost like climate change creates almost a vicious cycle in which the energy we're producing is changing the climate. But to survive the changing climate, we have to use more energy. So what would you say is the interruption to that cycle? Because obviously we don't want people to die because they can't keep their insulin cold. We don't want people to die from heat stroke. But at the same time, we don't want people to die from the emissions from a power plant. So what is the middle ground?
What's the fix to this
Yeah.
global crisis? Look, I don't know. I'll be honest with that. But I mean, there are really good arguments for distributed renewable electricity for poorer communities. I mean, I don't know why we're so hell-bent on maintaining this centralized grid system, which is not actually providing us with the electricity we need, right? Especially with the generation capacity where it is, right? We have an opportunity to roll out small-scale electricity for communities where they are. It goes into their hands. It's community-owned. And, there's the opportunity, right, to at least break one of these cycles. Make sure people can keep a fridge on for their bare essentials, right? It's that simple. Look, the broader systemic issues, how you keep industry alive, how you maintain a middle and upper classes grossly disproportionate energy consumption, I don't know. In fact, I would suggest that they need to sacrifice, right? And we're talking about, you mentioned it, it's demand, right, demand side management. why was that emitted, right? If you have the biggest consumers of electricity who aren't being regulated properly emitted from this document, what are you really saying, right? You have the opportunity to give poorer people who need it most, that's the concept of energy justice, electricity very quickly, very cheaply. And yet you want to maintain this expensive system that doesn't actually provide electricity to those who need it.
Yeah, I think there's something really fascinating about the distributed renewable electricity system. And when you say that, a lot of things come into my mind. I think of ministers saying the word baseload a lot. I think of people talking about how renewables can't manage that. And then people start talking about the cost of batteries and things like that. But I think this is a point where I'd actually want to go back to you, Ros. So for now, I want to talk about what are the dangers of moving to a distributed renewable electricity system? Because there seems to be a lot of caution. And I think at times we can wonder if there's, shall we say, less than savory intentions for people doing it. But I think also a lot of experts seem to make very compelling cases for there being issues with certain amounts of a distributed system. But would you be able to talk to that for a moment?
Yeah, I wanted to ask if I can do a quick thing on carbon
Go for it.
accounting.
I'll ask again afterwards.
Okay, cool. Because I also do carbon stuff and have done carbon things for a long time. So obviously there's hundreds of greenhouse gases, and in general, a little bit of CO2 in our atmosphere is good. It's what maintains life on Earth. It's what traps the incoming solar radiation and stops it going out. The problem is we've had increasing levels of anthropogenic greenhouse gas emissions starting to accumulate.
And for our listeners, anthropogenic means man-made or human-made.
Starting to accumulate in the atmosphere, and we're just trapping too much outgoing radiation. So, as Malik was saying, there's many gases that do it, but most places in the world manage it in terms of 6 priority gases. CO2 is the most common greenhouse gas, so everything is managed in terms of CO2 equivalent. So methane is also converted into CO2 equivalent amount. There's also nitrous oxide, which when you convert to CO2 equivalent is 298 times as potent as CO2. But on the bright side, there are fewer molecules of nitrous oxide going into the atmosphere than, say, carbon dioxide. There's also sulfur hexafluoride, which is actually used in transmission systems as a gas to prevent sparking. So actually one of the big uses of it is actually in electricity systems as well.
And transmission systems, you're referring to the pylons, to all the power lines that bring power to everyone's house, right?
So mostly it's actually used in the switchgear. So those pylons are like 132,000 volts or even more. Sometimes in the 30s, sometimes in the 80s, in some countries all the way up to 700. But basically they step electricity up from the voltage that we use to 20 to 40, industrial 400, and they step it up to a much higher voltage to transmit it, because then you have less transmission and distribution losses. But then you step it up and you do a lot of switching. And in the switching, you have the sulfur hexafluoride to stop the sparking.
Is that those substations that we see that seem to continually breaking?
Yes, so we have had a lot of failures. One of the things is it's transformers that switch up and switch down, and transformers aren't meant to be switched the frequency that we're switching them with load shedding. It's just not part of their design lifetime. So we're going to continue to see more failures as load shedding continues, because we're really operating equipment that's beyond its design lifetime, and not all of this equipment has been maintained the way it should be, depending on issues like, say, municipal deficits, because a lot of our electricity is actually distributed through municipalities and not through Eskom. So if a municipality is bankrupt, if they're not doing any of their maintenance, we can expect that to be a point of failure.
So if I'm understanding, oddly enough, also load shedding and the breaking of our system also leads to increased emissions because of these things getting damaged and releasing those gases.
So in normal management, you'd be capturing your sulfur hexafluoride, doing your repairs and then refilling and topping up. And it is sort of a standard practice. Obviously, if there's a fire, there could be problems with release. And then there's HFCs and PFCs. One of the good thing with the hole in the ozone layer, it's one of the positive stories. It's an environment crisis that was actually solved by global action when we stopped using CFCs as propellants in aerosols, and now that hole's actually closing. So there is like at least sort of a blueprint and a framework for people to take sort of action. There were just much better substitution options for CFCs as propellants versus fossil fuels, and how many people drive their economy very much through energy and fossil fuels. It's a more complicated problem to solve climate change.
Okay,
Right.
but it's a useful case study to understand that we can actually stop destroying things if we want to, and if we set our minds to it. And
I like to believe it. It keeps me hopeful.
for sure. I think it would be hard to get by if we didn't feel hopeful. Yeah, I think there was a lot there that would be wonderful to explore, and I'm really hoping we do in future podcasts and videos. But there's something I specifically wanted to ask you about, and it's something Malik raised, which was about the distributed renewable electricity system. So effectively, that's, the idea that people could have a town powered by its own solar grid and wind, or just if we look at our homes, and lots of sort of more affluent South Africans are now able to afford solar panels and batteries to withstand load shedding. But there's also a lot of people who have raised concerns about a distributed system, and then they raise terms like base load and grid stability, and that renewables can be damaging to that. Would you be able to explain what they're talking about when they talk about those terms, and what are the upsides and downsides that you would say there are to a distributed energy system or electricity system?
Sure. So maybe it's best to start at why we have load shedding. And we have load shedding because the system operator has to manage the frequency on the grid. Now, you're probably bored at some point sitting in science class or maths class, watching them draw a sine wave on the board and thinking like, when will this ever be useful to me? But that's how electricity moves. It moves in a sine wave, and it moves in 50 hertz per second. So there's 50 sine cycles per second. And it's very important that this frequency gets maintained on the whole grid. And what starts to pull the frequency out is when there is a mismatch between demand and supply. And why it's crucial is there's a whole bunch of protection mechanisms on our plants, because operating below a certain frequency for a very short amount can actually damage generation plant for its lifetime. And sort of this plant is meant to run for 50 years. So you'd then have sort of a cascading failure as sort of the transmission system starts like shutting off.
So this is why when we hear, a plant tripped, but actually like 4 or 5 plants trip at the same time. Is it because there was essentially an issue of this nature?
I would say no, because the system operator is actually very good. They manage the frequency very well. They do an incredibly difficult job. But that's also why we have so much uncertainty and changing levels of load shedding so quickly, as they have to drop more megawatts of demand out of the system to try and make sure that the frequency stays within the bounds, that we don't have like cascading tripping of the system. When we have multiple plants failing, it could be sort of a central issue like a milling plant issue or failure, or perhaps sometimes boiler tube leaks, although mostly that should be confined to just one boiler and one unit, or say a water plant treatment, because you have to have very specialized water to go through a turbine. It's basically distilled water, it's demineralized water. So if you have water plant failures and cooling tower failures, that can take out multiple units. But really, I would say like root cause analysis has to be done every time. We all know very well about Kusile and the stack collapse and what happened there. So yeah, and some things I think are just like routine projections and routine trips, as you say, but not all of them are the same. And I think that's also the complexity of solving the problem.
And then to get back to that, so I kind of heard you getting to this point that managing the frequency in the grid is really, really hard. So how does having all these renewables on the grid affect that?
One of the things is spinning plant and rotating plant has a better sort of response to like step changes in load, because there's sort of like momentum behind it. But it's not that that's the only way to generate. Many South Africans that are running on their own private generation systems with batteries will know that it's quite easy to do that. So definitely at a home scale, a small lithium-ion battery can absolutely help with this. they're looking at that as well. And there's critical points in the grid where Eskom's installing large batteries, more to unlock more capacity on the network. But if you have a lot of renewable energy and you have big swings, sometimes it can cause sort of power quality issues. Other countries are looking at solving this through synchronous condensers. We're also looking at grid forming inverters. There are definitely solutions to the problem. It's not untrue that there aren't challenges. There are, but there is technology, and with the will, there is absolutely the way to solve it. It's just coming forward with something that's going to protect the frequency and how the system operator can operate the grid. And I know that the system operator themselves are looking into what higher amounts of renewable energy on the grid actually means for operations and stability.
Yeah, I think there were two terms you used there, which I think I've never heard before. I can't even remember what they were anymore. But I think that's also, and I think this is a good time to point out to our listeners, we're also going to be doing an Energy Comms podcast as well with Ros. And I think we'll go more in depth into how some of these technical systems work. And I think something that was really fascinating to me was when we often think of the grid, we just think of the connection lines connecting the power plants. But there's also something about maintaining these levels and how the grid managers can actually bring on board other systems to do that, to deal with it. But that big takeaway I heard was actually what you were saying, is that this is manageable. This isn't an unmanageable problem. So one of there we go.
I can add a bit more if it's helpful. There's one more point. So
yeah, would you go ahead?
So how other countries are managing it is they've got interconnected transmission systems. So they're able to bring in power from other areas of the world where there is excess capacity. This is obviously quite complex in South Africa, with being the largest sort of power generator in the whole region. We are sort of the biggest installed capacity anywhere around us. So there are less options to manage it, but options do exist.
I definitely am going to get into that at a later point, and to talk about us being an energy island to some degree. So I think in terms of what the IRP is talking about, we've talked about how it's two different crises. There's the acute crisis, which is that load shedding happens and load shedding kills people because they can't get urgent care they need, their insulin goes off, etc., etc. But I think what would be good now is to explain a bit further what we mean by sort of the climate crisis, and how a climate crisis isn't just something which means it's warmer and it's uncomfortable, but it's actually something a lot more dangerous than that. Malik, I know you've done a lot of work in terms of what 1.5, 2 degrees Celsius, 3 degrees Celsius increase in global temperatures mean. Do you want to talk us through a bit why solving for the climate crisis is so important, and if we don't, what are the consequences?
Yeah. Think about what it means for every step of your life. For example, if you're a small child, you want to go to school, right? If you're a rich kid and temperatures are getting to about 35 degrees, you're in a nice private school, put your aircon on, you're okay, more or less, until you have to play sports, If you're a poor child, you go and you study probably in a tin classroom, right? If it's 35 degrees outside, it's a lot hotter inside, right? We're talking 3-4 degrees. You can't study like that. You get held back.
You fall asleep in class, right?
Yeah. And that's a socioeconomic impact. That's a whole generation lost, right? If we get to those sorts of temperature extremes, which we're already in, right?
Or I suppose the alternative is that we then are required to put air cons in every classroom, which is billions of rands if we think about that.
Yeah. Yeah. The other thing, right? Food. Right, so I study soil science, I research African food systems, how they respond to climate change. They're being decimated right now. 2022, East Africa had a drought lasting a few months. 100,000 people died. 100,000 people died. A whole host of reasons, right? Mainly famine, right? From Somalia, Kenya. These people are, they're subject to a food system which is not responsive to climate impacts. Okay, gets very hot, some production goes down. You have a very concentrated food system where a few people are responsible for the distribution of it. You have a lot of poor people. If just a handful of people are responsible for your food system, they drive prices up to maximize their revenue. food prices go up, people can't afford it because they're spending upwards of 50% of their monthly income on food, they die, right? Climate breakdown is social collapse, right? And when we get to 2 degrees centigrade of global average warming, society collapses. That's the trajectory on. That's the urgency of talking about this issue.
So what I'm hearing you start to talk about is that it's not actually just about the temperature. So yeah, there's the example of the classroom, that this is an average increase, which, let's say a classroom in Limpopo, that doesn't mean Limpopo day is 2 degrees hotter. That Limpopo day could be 5 degrees hotter. But beyond the temperature, the climate change equals change in rainfall, which is the droughts. And what you've now explored as well is that it means societal change. What are specific South African things that we're worried about in terms of the impact on our society, the risks we face? Do you have any sort of insight into that you can share?
Yeah. 2 days ago, there was a report, maize production in the country down by 13%. Down by 13% because of this heat wave that's been 2 weeks long, right? This is at 1.5 degrees of warming because of El Nino, right? So this is not necessarily even like close to what we're going to see because of further global warming, right? I'll give you an example, right? So I studied crop production and desiccation. Basically, how do crops survive when there is no water available to them, right? Maize plants, an average maize plant dies when it's exposed to temperatures at about 35 degrees for, a few days at a time without rainfall. The African continent, 90% of agriculture is dependent on rainfall, right? For South Africa, you have a huge amount of subsistence farmers also dependent on rainfall. You disrupt that cycle, you disrupt their ability to grow food, right? That's not only meeting their own, nutritional needs, they also use that as a form of income to maintain their lives, right? So you devastate those communities. And so that's really what we're talking about. And it shouldn't just be maize, right? This applies to all plants. When we talk about our sort of deciduous fruits, so horticulture sector, fruits, vegetables, etc. When our winter gets to a point where we no longer have freezing temperatures, right? That disrupts the plant's ability to grow food, right? So fruits, especially your stone fruits, they require freezing temperatures to go dormant.
And
cherries, etc. in Vicksburg, right? When the winter temperature goes up, all of a sudden you can't do that. The trees don't produce the fruits at the quality and the quantity that they're supposed to. You don't get a harvest. That's thousands and thousands of jobs on the line, right? And also huge amounts of export earnings for the country.
Yeah. I'm imagining areas like Ceres, a lot of those sort of Western Cape farmland regions where they do a lot of those fruit farmings, also the Eastern Cape.
Northwest.
And we're not talking about the richest parts of the country. Hey, we're talking about sort of, these are the vulnerable communities. In climate comms, a lot of what we're looking at, I think, is adaptation versus mitigation. So adaptation being how are we going to have to change with the existing climate change that we have coming, and mitigation being, well, let's try and keep it as low as possible. Because you're talking actually about crises that are happening today, but every degree it gets way, way worse. So I suppose that leads into the next question. Would you say this IRP is addressing that at all? Would you say this IRP is talking to the climate crisis?
Yeah, take a guess. No, right? No. And it gets nowhere close to where it should be. I mean, I was trawling through it in preparation for this podcast, trying to find acknowledgement of how serious the climate crisis is. It's just nowhere. They talk to policy statements that we've heard Ramaphosa spout out, and it's nonsensical, right? It doesn't tell the truth, right? Recently, we had a report of the Atlantic current, which is basically responsible for the entire Earth's weather systems. It could collapse within a time frame of now to the next 75 years. We don't know when. When that system collapses, food production out the window. Your ability to adapt to climate extremes, done, obsolete. That's what this crisis means. That's not addressed at all in this IRP.
That's really disappointing and scary to think of. I think when we hear other experts talk about it, and particularly the people involved in drafting it, I think they talk about in different ways, but there's three priorities they're looking at, right? The cost and the economic cost of whatever we do to intervene in our crises, the timeline, and I think particularly with addressing sort of the acute load shedding crisis, and then the longer emissions and harm that these power plants and our current coal-based generation emits. I think you've talked a lot to how this IRP does not talk to emissions and the environmental harm. But I think to go back to you for a second, Ros, would you say this IRP is talking well to the timeline to solve the load shedding crisis? And would you say it's talking well to the costs involved? I.e., we talked about that. You mentioned before the low cost models versus medium high costs in the previous version. Is the IRP talking to the cost and the timeline very well?
Yes and no. Life is complex and we live in a grey world. In terms of cost, there's definitely comments that the costs may be too high with the LASO data being used instead of local REAP data. That could probably put renewable
Before you go further, do you want to just explain quickly why using local, what's the difference in using local and international data for that purpose?
It's better to use local data wherever possible. There's also different costs of financing large infrastructure projects wherever you are. Over the timelines that we look at it, it's also got a little bit of insight in sort of the resources that we have in this country using actual data that's come out of bid processes. And it's also like a built on and informed sort of costing and tariff. Everyone's seen the progression was very high in the first bid round, while there was a lot of uncertainty in how these projects were going to close in terms of legal and finance and the resources. And once sort of the wind and the solar resource was actually like proved and ground tested, and as we went for further rounds, the data just got better and the cost got lower. Timeline, definitely renewable energy is the quickest to come in, and we do see a certain amount of that. In terms of emissions, I'm going to go out on a limb and disagree a little bit with Malik, because I do believe that there is a role for gas in terms of flexible dispatchable generation that complements renewables quite well. Definitely it would have an emission advantage versus the liquid fuels that we're burning. You're definitely emitting more from the diesel and the open cycle gas turbines, and they are a crucial component of balancing supply and demand. If we put gas in there, it would help that problem. The concerns with transmission of gas through pipeline are real, and we also don't have a lot of pipeline capacity in South Africa, so maybe FSRU units at our ports, but Transnet also doesn't have the capacity to handle them. That's floating storage and regasification units. So gas can come by pipeline, it can come by train, and it also can come by a marine route. And where we don't have like the infrastructure at the moment, that's maybe one of the good options. There's also a broader energy crisis, the broader gas crisis. Current gas in South Africa is going to stop sort of mid-2026. Notice being given to market. So obviously having like an anchor tenant like power generation could bring gas into the country a little bit faster. It could give the business case to get gas in. And why it's relevant is manufacturing entities that are producing glass, like they just can't operate without gas. If the gas in the pipeline dries up, those businesses close their doors and all of those people like lose their jobs. So I'm actually pro gas, but not gas as constant baseload, gas as sort of peaking to really manage when you have 3 days of unseasonable rain, because maybe we have a La Nina year instead of an El Nino year, and then there's just cloud cover all over, and then we have underperformance, and then that can come in beyond just the storage to help be a balancing factor in the grid.
Yeah, I think there's so many things there. I think that what a La Nina and El Nino years are is something that we really should explore as well at a later point. And I think Climate Commons will do some videos on that. But there was something. So something I'm hearing is that so effectively that we're talking about is what you're saying is that we need a sort of a grid which is heavy on renewables and then using gas to supplement wherever we have issues, so that we don't have that grid instability that people are concerned about. But if I'm also understanding correctly, that's also talked of as an interim thing. And one of the criticisms of the IRP is that it doesn't meet our commitments. Specifically, I think our commitments to, was it the Paris COP? Is that right? Would either of you guys like to talk to that? Maybe you, Malik, first, about what are the consequences? So we've talked about some of these ultimate consequences of climate change, but can you talk to some other consequences that if we're not meeting these targets, and what are these targets from the Paris COP conference?
I think the one interesting thing from the Paris Agreement, I mean, besides the fact that it was effectively a cop out, right? Like we knew we were destined for above 1.5 degrees before that COP, and yet they still decided that that was the target that the world would try and reach. So we start from that point, but it did get world commitments towards, a predetermined target. Let me stress one thing, right? South Africa doesn't operate in itself, right? If we depend on gas, we get subject to trade tariffs. I'm thinking here specifically of the carbon border adjustment mechanism that Europe has just approved, right? Which is, it's trying to get Europe's emissions down. It sort of says, well, we won't import heavily carbon intensive production into our borders. And so it puts incentive on all of these carbon intensive economies, clean up your act or you can't trade with us, all right? And so that's another risk of depending on gas. And, gas infrastructure, also more expensive to build out than renewable infrastructure, which is another consideration. Also, price volatility in the gas market, super scary. We can't depend on it as a secure source at, predictable prices. So there's all of these considerations beyond the climate considerations of supplementing energy supply.
Yeah, that's carbon border adjustment mechanism, the CBAM, right? The European tax. I think that's a very, very interesting one. And I think, I don't know if I'm reading between lines here, but if I'm getting from what Raz is saying, gas, if it's used to offset other higher carbon emitting things, but still fundamentally we should as much renewables and as much low carbon energy as possible. In that context, does that make sense? And does the IRP do that? Because I think it looks like the IRP is saying a lot of gas, but it's not necessarily talking about turning off coal at the same time.
Well, yes, you mean?
Yeah.
Yeah. Look, I don't know. I'm not an energy modeler.
Okay,
I wouldn't be able to say. What I would say though is that, investments in gas infrastructure least cost for energy security? I don't know. If we can't answer that question, then I think it's dead in the water. That's before we even consider the climate considerations, and before we even consider methane leaks, which I think we really shouldn't understate the importance of. Let me leave it at that.
Okay. And then I'll push it over to you, Roz, then. So in the current version of the IRP, so because they're talking about this massive delay in terms of shutting down coal, but they are bringing on gas, does that mean effectively we're going to be looking at a higher emitting economy in the medium term or short term in terms of our electricity production?
So, as I understand the IRP, they're looking at propping up or improving the energy availability factor till 2030, and then starting to proceed with a decommissioning schedule for our older coal plants from 2031 to 2050. As Malik says, there is a lot of gas in one of the scenarios. I think it's as much as 6,000 megawatts.
And for our listeners, that's about 6 stages of load shedding equivalent.
Yeah, absolutely. And then also quite interestingly, in all of the, well, not in all of the scenarios, in a lot of the scenarios, there's actually a massive bias to wind. And it's interesting to understand where the transmission capacity is and how that could be unlocked in the network, notwithstanding the good work that Eskom has been doing on how we could curtail renewable energy producers to unlock further capacity and use what we have at the moment. I think we should be doing more. I mean, harking back to the Paris Agreement, I remember meeting with friends to celebrate, because before that all we had was Kyoto. And since the Kyoto Protocol, everything seemed to stall and nobody was coming together with some sort of global agreement. And at least Paris came in and said 2 degrees is critical and we're going to aim for 1.5 degrees. In firm agreement with Malik that we're pretty much already there with all of the carbon that has been emitted, and definitely climate change is going to influence the most vulnerable in our society the hardest, which is criminal. Latest COPs, we've at least seen like adaptation funding come out, which hopefully that can actually flow and start going into the investments. But I mean, a lot of climate adaptation is sort of watercourse management and protection, stormwater, and I think everybody knows from where they live and perhaps where they travel, like there hasn't been much dam investment. The City Highlands Water Project Phase 2 is behind, and Joburg's the largest city in the world not built on a watercourse, and the Val Dam feeds all of the surrounding provinces. Like it's another crisis that's just sitting in the wings. But
And they're
I
all
think we
connected.
must,
It's scary.
I think we must maybe go back to the IRP.
No, but what I think is so fascinating about these crises is that the IRP is talking to the electricity crises, right? The climate-related one and the load shedding related one. But it's really that these all connect to each other. If you don't have electricity, you can't pump water. You know, if you don't have electricity or you don't have the resources to make the cement for the dam as part of the Lesotho Highlands Water Project, we can't get the water from Lesotho to Johannesburg, which is the biggest metropole in sub-Saharan Africa, right? Or is Abuja bigger? But certainly in SADC. So no, I think raising that, but I think that leads into a good place, I think, to sort of start closing off the discussion. There's a lot of stuff that as individuals we can't do that we need to potentially mobilize for. But what are things we can do, whether it's mobilization or actions like that? And then I'm going to go to both of you guys now, and you can talk about some of the stuff you've been working on and what you'd recommend people look at how they can get involved in not necessarily just the IRP, but the climate crisis, the power crisis, and things like that in general. Can we start with you, Malik?
What do people do? Yeah. So, like I said at the start, I'm from Extinction Rebellion, or at least that's the capacity I'm speaking in today. Extinction Rebellion calls for ordinary people to basically engage in civil resistance against, quite frankly, a criminal political and economic elite, right? And that's what's needed by everyone. And the reason why I'm stressing this is because we've had 30 years of policy nonsense and a lot of them are my friends, but a lot of the climate NGOs, environmental NGOs, speaking to, what's the lowest cost option here? What could you do for more energy efficiency there? That doesn't convince anyone, right? Unfortunately, that doesn't convince anyone. You need a sustained civic movement that gets pressure to decision makers. And so, what happens when they get there? What are we asking for people to do? I believe strongly in the idea of citizens' assemblies, right? You get a group of ordinary people from the country, you inform them properly about all the options that are available to them, drawbacks and positives of each, and you let them decide what path the country needs to take. Because actually, if we leave it to the Gwede Mantashes of the world, we're going to burn this country.
Well, that's a bit of a name drop there, but okay. No, but I think we'll definitely make sure we put the link to the South African affiliates of Extinction Rebellion. So if you want to be involved in activism, that's definitely one direction you can go. I think I'm going to hand over to you, Ros, now. And I know you're involved, particularly from, once again, the technical sides and understanding the energy systems. Do you want us to talk to that and what people can do?
Yeah, I think a lot of comments are going to go in. We've spoken about the data. We've spoken about energy efficiency. Definitely, there could be a role for more distributed generation. One thing we hadn't touched on, and I thought it was interesting that the IRP made mention of hydrogen, but spoke only about hydrogen being supplied by off-grid energy, which is most likely going to be renewable, which is good because we do want to make green hydrogen, and perhaps it's a strategic export advantage. Yeah, I would encourage people to take part in the consultations. From my side, I would say definitely lobby for renewable energy. Air pollution is extreme. It's interesting that there's a plan to have air pollution exemptions till 2030, but small boiler regulations and other regulations are getting harsher and stricter. So I'd say equity in implementing air pollution and air pollution controls, I think, is very important because, I mean, it's the air we breathe. That's also how a carbon emission trading system works, because it doesn't matter where the molecule of CO2 is emitted or not emitted, because of global air circulation, it's everywhere. So particulates are local air pollution, and definitely in Mpumalanga is a key area and a key issue. But I think sort of we should have better pollution controls across the board, not heavy regulation in a sector and ability to just pollute indiscriminately. There is obviously a very big issue with supply and demand, and there is sort of some incentive with economic growth to keep the coal stations running. But is there a middle ground that could be found that's better for everyone's health and safety? As individuals, what can you do? So energy efficiency, continue to heed the call to switch off, reduce waste, reduce excessive water use. If you have the space and you are able to do some composting, not getting food waste to landfill also reduces a lot of methane when it goes into sort of anaerobic decomposition. So composting is actually a hugely valuable thing that you can do in your own yard, in your own space. Maybe take one less flight a year if you can. Consider what your options are. Maybe one day a week you don't eat meat. Maybe there's some days where you can walk and save a commute. Less fast fashion. Everybody needs to look at their climate impact and decide what's appropriate for them and what they want to do. But I think it is a crisis that we'll need a lot of collective action to solve.
Yeah, I think it's those personal examples are great ways that you can feel empowered to do something. But as I think we've all talked about today, it's actually the biggest one is the lobbying. It's the people with power. There's an example we've talked about before is, you don't choose how you get to work, really. It's chosen by society around you. Whether it's safe to bike, whether it's safe to take a bus. And that's emissions that you are required to do, no matter what else you're doing. But great. I think that was a really, informative discussion. There's so much to unpack in the IRP that there's no way we can get through it in an hour. But I think we've started to sort of unpack that, one, there are some shortcomings in this version. And I think being involved in the discussion about trying to get those shortcomings fixed, both in terms of solving our short-term energy crisis, but also in terms of dealing with kind of climate change and the urgency with which we need to deal with that. For those interested, we will be having another podcast, actually, and that'll be done by our sister campaign, Energy Comms. We'll be chatting to Ros there and going a lot more in depth to some of the things we didn't go into about how the energy system works and what the IRP is talking about specifically related to electricity, but not so much in terms of the climate discussion. But yeah, I think I want to end off by just thanking you both for coming through today. And I think it was a really helpful discussion. Thanks, guys.
Thank you.
Awesome. Thanks. For any youth in South Africa under 35 that want to understand a little bit more about these energy issues, Sanya, at the moment, because it's our 100-year anniversary, we are currently offering free membership for this year for the youth. So anyone under 35, please go past the website, sign up and join. We've also got a LinkedIn page and group where we can talk about energy issues. You can post things that are of interest, of relevance, and keep the energy discussion going.
Thanks for listening to this Climate Comms podcast. Feel free to check out all our other social media channels, YouTube, Instagram, Twitter/X, TikTok. We're putting out lots of videos and content all about the climate crisis, adaptation, mitigation, everything you need to know.